Okay, so again, welcome to our live Q&A for our second attempt. If you missed the first one, which I've deleted out of embarrassment, Liam and Nathan, who were going to be on the live Q&A, are both unwell. Not super unwell, but because of being a little bit extra careful at the moment, we opted to keep them at home. And so Kirsten and I will be doing the Q&A. So still send your questions through. Be slightly more gentle than you would have been.
Well, Rob's answering them, not me, so be as hard as you want.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Well, let's just get straight into it.
Sure.
So in verse 14, Jesus says, stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. Is Jesus talking about the man's disability being a result of his sin in the past, even though he repudiated this later in John 9, 1-3?
There you go. So I'll read out John 9, 1-3, just so we have that context. So it says, as he went along, he, that's Jesus, saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned. Jesus said, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And so the question, if I've got it right, is why then in chapter 5, does Jesus give him this warning to stop sinning or something worse might happen? Is the implication that sin causes, so he was crippled? Is that a result of sin? I don't think it necessarily is. We don't have to read that into the text. It certainly opens the door that that's a possibility, but it's clearly not always the case, as we saw from John 9. The main thing I think that it tells us is that this guy that Jesus healed in John 5, he didn't heal him because he was a particularly good guy. He hadn't earned it, he wasn't righteous, and so that wasn't the reason that Jesus healed him. He was a sinner. So I think that's the most we can say with certainty. But it does ask that question of where does sin and consequences sit. From John 9 we can say definitely that not all physical ailments are the result of sin. So that tells us that we have to be really careful not to assume that. So if you come across someone who's sick or crippled in some way, you certainly can't jump to that conclusion. You certainly can't say, oh, that's because of sin. We should never make that assumption. It does raise the question, maybe if something happens, we should consider, is sin a factor in this, and bring that to God. But ultimately, we can't correlate them directly without more knowledge that typically we won't have. It is good to recognise that with sin comes consequences. Often they're really direct. So if I get drunk and go driving, there's probably going to be a consequence, whether it's me in jail or me hurting myself or others. So it's a direct consequence to my sin. But we also know that's not always the case. That's kind of one of the complaints in Ecclesiastes, that the evil guy seems to prosper and the good guy seems to have poverty. And so it's not always a correlation. But sin has done damage in the world, so the world is broken because of sin. But we have to be really mindful not to necessitate direct correlation between the two. Does that sound good? Mm-hmm. That's what I've got.
Alright. Second question. Can you expand on Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man in verse 27? Okay. And if you've got time, or should we do that part first?
Yeah, let's do that first. So verse 27 just says, it's Jesus speaking about God, and he says, and he has given him authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. So God has given Jesus the authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. The Son of Man is the term that Jesus applies to himself often. And it particularly seems to refer to Daniel chapter 7. So there's this vision that Daniel has. Let me try and get there really quick. Missed it. Daniel 7, this vision of that Daniel has, and he sees the Ancient of Days God. Okay. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool, his throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. Well, I got a little bit, I'm going to skip ahead. So verse 13 of Daniel 7. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, and he was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And so this Ancient of Days is God, and then this Son of Man comes with God's authority. He judges. He has these godlike qualities, and that's kind of what we're seeing Jesus express in John 5, that he's God as well, that he and the Father are one and the same, and so separate but same in God's status. And so I think that's Jesus pointing out that he's that guy. So that's that.
Cool. Verse 24 focuses on faith for salvation. Can you explain what Jesus means to convey in verse 29, which seems to be of works?
Yeah. So in 24, very truly, I tell you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be judged, but has crossed over from death to life. And so the eternal life comes through faith rather than works. But then in 29, those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. And so that seems much more works-based, that it's about whether you've done good or not. I think that's a tension we see through the Bible, that often those who are saved are talked about as having done good. And really I think it's just the necessary fruit of faith. So as we think about what Nathan talked about, that we need to know Jesus, and knowing who he is and putting our faith in him is where our salvation comes from, there's a necessary fruit that will come from that. As we know Jesus, by implication we'll listen to him, we'll follow him, and so we'll be the ones who've done what is good. I think it's that simple, that if you really follow Jesus, you'll follow Jesus, and so there'll be fruit that comes from it. But always salvation comes from the faith.
How do you overcome feelings of jealousy?
How do you overcome feelings of jealousy?
Forget that. That's a different week.
That's from a different week.
Another question. I'm just testing if Rob was really listening, Are we just being judgmental when we say that someone isn't a Christian?
Yeah. So really good question. I guess one of the implications of what Nathan was saying is that he was making really clear, if you don't know the real Jesus, then you can't be saved, that you need to know the real Jesus to be saved. I guess in that sense there is a line. So Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me. And so there is a really clear line in the sand that only people who know Jesus can be saved, and that's important for us to articulate. We don't want to pretend that's not true, because salvations are at stake. We want people to know that, because we want people to be saved, to know that there's a necessary response to Jesus. But at the same time, I think sometimes Christians are tempted to let that carry over into maybe overly judging actions. And so we do need to be careful of that. It's hard to look on the surface and see what's going on in someone's heart. And so we don't want to overstep our mark there. The passage is really clear that it's Jesus who has the authority to judge it and not us. But we know how to be saved, and so it's important that we communicate that and share that with others. And so that will be offensive sometimes. one of the things that we'll see as we keep going through John is that Jesus divides. When we respond to Jesus, either we follow him and accept his truth, or we don't, and there's a division that happens, and that division feels judgy in a sense, but it's just the natural course of responding to Jesus. And so, we can say with certainty, if you don't know the real Jesus, you can't be saved, because you need him for salvation. It's not what we do, it's him.
Alright, in verse 24, this is a similar-ish question. In verse, well, same thing. In verse 24, Jesus says, "He who believes will not be judged." How does this look after Jesus returns and the world is judged? So I guess the question is around, does that mean the person who's saved doesn't get judged at all, or do they just get judged favourably? The ultimate picture we kind of see is that for the Christian, Jesus takes their place, and so their judgment is as though God is looking at Jesus instead of them and seeing Jesus' works and not ours. And so in that sense, I guess that's the picture here, that they won't be judged, they won't be condemned. Maybe is a simple way to think of it. But so we'll all face judgment, and our relationship with Jesus is the only thing that can have us judged positively rather than condemned. Okay. Does it matter if I say I have a personal relationship with Jesus or God? So does it matter if I say I have a personal relationship with Jesus, God? Does it mean the same to others? So I guess the question, correct me if I'm wrong, is saying if I say I have a personal relationship with Jesus, is that the same thing as me saying I have a personal relationship with God? Does that mean the same thing to other people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that's in some sense it's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? So, I put Jesus and God in that same category, and so, and if I know you and I know where you're coming from, I'll understand better. I guess the danger there is sometimes we try and soften how we speak to people. So I think in general the world is very warm to the idea of God, and God is less offensive in a sense than Jesus, because when we say Jesus, we mean a very particular view of God. We mean the God of the Bible, not just generally this vague notion of God. When we say God, people can kind of take on that vague version and let it be what they want it to be. I guess a bit like, so Nathan in the sermon talked about, you can have two people both using the word Jesus, both describing themselves as Christian, and mean very different things. And so it does matter what we believe. And so there's it doesn't matter in a sense, do we say God, Jesus? What matters is what we mean, and we have to be really careful not to soften that for the sake of appeasing people. We want to be really clear about what we believe about God and about Jesus. And that's why I think people find the word Jesus offensive, because it's a much clearer statement about what we believe.
Now, technically speaking, do we have any questions here? Am I looking at the right thing?
I think you're looking at the right thing, and there are no questions that I can see.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of the questions, unless you've got a question and you quickly send it in now.
I'll just...
You just double check.
Has come through here, no. So that's good. I guess that's a good time to wrap up. We'll give ourselves an early mark since we got thrown in the deep end at the last minute.
It's been 17 minutes.
17 minutes, there you go. That's pretty good.
That's pretty normal.
I took more than I realised. But let me encourage you. Encourage Nathan. What a great job he's done for his first sermon. I found it wonderful. I was really encouraged by it. So why not check my text saying, well done. But otherwise, We look forward to getting into John 6 next week. A great passage. So we'll see you then.
Bye.